Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. How are you all doing? I hope you're all doing really well. This week I'm going to be doing another recent reads video. I'm going to be telling you about all of the books that I've read in February. I've had a really good reading month in February, I think. I've read some literary fiction, some classics, some YA, a short story, a classical retelling, and all of them have been pretty good, so reading's been a lot of fun recently. So going straight into the books I read, the first book that I read this month was Mansfield Park by Jane Austen. So this was technically a reread for me. I'm pretty sure I read this years and years and years ago when I was a teenager, but I didn't really remember it and I wanted to reread it before I did my Jane Austen video, which I put up a couple of weeks ago now, where I talked about Jane Austen and which books are my favourites and my least favourites. So I wanted to reread it to make sure that I was ranking it correctly. I'll leave that video linked down below if you want to check it out and find out which ones are my favourites. So Mansfield Park is about a young woman called Fanny Price who is born into quite a poor family, and she is adopted by her wealthy relatives and goes and lives at Mansfield Park with her cousins. Through the book, we see what happens when the two Crawford siblings move to the area. They are very wealthy and glamorous and flirtatious, and we get to see what happens when they meet Fanny and her cousins, and all of the fallout that happens from that. In short, I absolutely love this. I basically love all of Jane Austen's work. I love her gorgeous and really specifically chosen prose. I love her complex and often ridiculous characters and her irony and wit as she's looking at these characters. I love her storylines. They're so fun and twisty, and all the romance going on and the different relationships, and I love the morals that underlie everything as well. This isn't my favourite ever Austen. I don't think it's her best story-wise, and I don't love Fanny as a protagonist as much as I love a lot of the other Austen protagonists, although I will say that she's pretty great in a very real way. She's quite brave and courageous in the small ways. So she isn't the most standout protagonist, but she is a very relatable one. Overall, this is a gem. It's gorgeous and really, really readable and fun, and it's particularly moralistic, which I really enjoy. So overall, I gave this one a 4 out of 5 stars. The next book that I read this month was The Silence of the Girls by Pat Barker. I've been meaning to read this book for quite a long time now. Obviously, as you've probably all seen, it received so much love and so much hype last year when it was released. It was on a lot of best of 2018 videos, and also recently my boyfriend Cameron read it and absolutely loved it, so it was about time I got to this, and I had very high expectations. So this is marketed as being a feminist The Iliad. So basically it's just a retelling of the famous story from the women's perspective. I absolutely love this premise. It's so good, and in lots of ways this book did exactly what I wanted it to and hoped it would. Retelling this story from a different perspective is genius, and it's so necessary. Pat Barker does not shy away from the horrors and all the just daily struggles that the women would have faced during this time. The Iliad is a bit misleading, I guess. It's not all fighting and glory and heroism. It's grim and traumatic and degrading. This book was so weirdly fun to read. Fun doesn't really seem like the right word because it was grim, but it was, and I mean that in the sense of it was so readable and so page-turning, and it had a really traditional story-like feel to it. It's the kind of book that you just get so swept up into whilst you're reading it. I will say that this book did fall a little bit short in certain areas for me, and I'm sure that was just because of the massive amount of hype that was going on before I picked up this book. Firstly, I didn't like that this book switched perspectives away from the female voice to the male one. So while most of the chapters focus on the female voice in this, some of the chapters focus on Achilles and we get to hear what's going on with him. And I thought that was not only self-defeating, I mean, the brilliance of this story is that we get to hear the female perspective. I also thought it was quite damaging to the book. This male perspective didn't bring anything to the book for me. It just wasn't better than if those chapters weren't there, and I really wish Pat Barker had just stuck to the female perspective. I found that really frustrating while reading. It just would have been so much more powerful and distinct if she had. And I also didn't think that the writing was particularly good in this novel, which was odd. That was a surprise to me. I've already said this was really readable, which is true, but I didn't find there to be much finesse in the writing at all. I actually found it to be quite clumsy at times, and definitely sometimes overwritten. I was hoping for such brilliant things in terms of the writing of this novel. Because I've read Pat Barker before, I read Regeneration by her, and she is such a brilliant writer. She is capable of such clever writing, and I love that, and I really wanted that from this. Overall, I think this is such a good book that so many people would love. I wouldn't hesitate in recommending it to anyone at all. I think what it's doing is great, and it does it in such an accessible and compulsively readable way, and I love that. It just didn't excel in all of the areas I hoped it would, so ultimately I gave this one a 4 stars. The next book that I read in February was a YA novel, and that was I Was Born for This by Alice Oseman. This is a YA contemporary novel that focuses on 2 teenage characters. So we have Angel Raheny, who is a teenage girl who absolutely loves this boy band called The Ark. She's really involved in their fandom, and she's going to go see them on tour. And then we also have Jimmy Carter Ritchie, who is the frontman of The Ark, and he's going through all of his own personal struggles to do with the fame and his personal identity. So I'm basically in love with Alice Oseman at the moment. I think she's so great. I read Radio Silence by her last month and loved it, and knew that I wanted to read more of her books as soon as possible. Luckily, my friend Anthony from Anthony Andrews also loves Alice Oseman, so we decided to read this together as a buddy read, me for the first time and him as a reread. I'm kind of afraid that my review of this book is going to sound exactly the same as my review of Radio Silence, and that's not because they're the same book at all. It's just that a lot of the strengths in Radio Silence are the strengths in this book. So essentially, Alice Oseman is really great for her representation in novels. In this book, we have different sexual identities, different gender identities, different faith positions, and none of it's forced. It's just Britain. And her teenagers are so spot on. They're so believable, so realistic. They go through a lot of the struggles that British teenagers do typically go through at the pivotal age of 17, and they speak like teenagers speak and like things that teenagers like. And ultimately, this book is just so readable. It's so good. All of the characters are so lovable and believable, and I really like both of the perspectives in this novel, both Angel's and Jimmy's. I didn't like one more than the other, which in itself is quite an accomplishment. There were a couple of things that I wasn't completely convinced by in this novel. A couple of the side characters weren't 100% thought through, I didn't think. I was kind of like, what's your point? And I also wasn't completely convinced by Angel's conversations with her parents all of the time. It seemed that all of their conversations were really relevant to the point of the book, which I didn't find totally believable. Overall, I just think this is amazing. I think it's fab. Everyone should go out and read Alice Oseman. I didn't quite love this as much as I loved Radio Silence. The relationships in that book in particular just blow these out of the water, I think, but overall it's really great, and I gave a 4 out of 5 stars. And I will say that Anthony absolutely loved this book as well. I believe he gave it a 5 stars, so pretty high praise. The next book that I read in February is tiny, and that is Mr. Salary by Sally Rooney. This is a tiny short story that's part of these little Faber short story collection things, and Cameron actually bought this for me as a surprise after I read Sally Rooney for the first time last month. I read Normal People and absolutely loved it, so that was pretty sweet. So if I remember correctly, this short story follows a woman called Suki who is in love with a man much older than herself, and she also has a pretty fractious relationship with her dying father. I really enjoyed reading this. It didn't absolutely blow me away. As in Normal People, Sally Rooney's strength is looking at flawed characters and their endlessly complex relationships with other humans. Her writing is incredibly specific and nuanced and insightful, and she's just got such a talent when it comes to writing about humans and relationships and communication. I feel like perhaps I read this one a bit too quickly. I think if I'd spent more time reading it more closely and analysing it, I would have found so much more brilliance in it. Or maybe I should reread it, I'm not sure. I'm sure there's so much more in here than I picked up on. Overall, I really did enjoy reading this. I think it was a lunch hour well spent. I think it sums up Sally Rooney's strengths very well, and I would recommend it if you're interested in picking it up. ultimately I gave it 4 stars. The next book that I read in February was Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. This novel opens when our protagonist meets and marries Maxime de Winter, who is a widower who recently lost his wife, Rebecca. The married couple then move to this massive country estate called Manderley, where the shadow of Rebecca is still very much present, and it's quite threatening. This novel is so well loved. I've been meaning to read Daphne du Maurier for ages. I've been really excited to get to her, and I can definitely see what all the hype is about. This novel has massive gothic horror vibes. It's very atmospheric, and it has a lot of mystery and intrigue and suspense, and it's very psychologically intense, and all these kind of things are not things that I tend to love in novels, but it was done very, very well here, like very well, and it suited the themes of the novel perfectly. The standout thing about this novel for me by a mile was the writing. I loved the writing in this novel. I found it so absorbing and beautiful to read. It's really unrestricted and free-flowing. There's so much detail and description. One of the techniques that Daphne du Maurier uses a lot in the book is that she allows the protagonist's imagination to wander off for a couple of pages, so we get to see what she imagines might happen before we get to see what actually happens. I thought this managed to capture the protagonist's youth and imagination so perfectly in the book, as well as adding to the uncertainty of what's real and what's not, and the kind of creepiness and whimsy that is all throughout this book. I think this book is brilliant at what it's doing. The atmosphere and the psychology of it all is really powerful and really cleverly done. For me, it wasn't my favourite book ever, but I think that's more due to my personal reading tastes rather than anything to do with the execution on Daphne du Maurier's part. For me, I gave this a 3.5 stars, but obviously I do think it's brilliant and definitely worth reading if it's something that sounds interesting to you. The next book that I picked up in February was Stand Tall Little Girl by Hope Virgo. This is a non-fiction book in which Hope details her journey with anorexia, and I actually ended up DNFing this one. So to explain what happened with this book, I was approached by someone from the publisher a couple of weeks ago asking if I wanted to receive a copy of this book because it's actually Eating Disorder Awareness Week this week when this video goes up, and they're wanting to promote this book a bit because they think it's really important and could be really enlightening for a lot of people to read. I said I would love to receive a copy of the book to give it a go reading it. I think mental illness is something that really should be discussed. As you probably all know from watching my channel, I've talked about my own struggles before, and I think we should really support different people talking about their own stories and sharing their own struggles with mental illness. So I thought if I could read this and if I liked it, then I could talk about it and add to the discussion surrounding Eating Disorder Awareness Week, and that would all be great. Unfortunately, I found this book very triggering basically as soon as I started reading it, so I ended up having to put it down. I don't have an eating disorder, but I do have generalized anxiety disorder and obsessive compulsive disorder, and a lot of the elements that go into having an eating disorder, such as anxiousness and need for control, are aspects of having anxiety and OCD as well, if that makes sense. Hope actually details a lot of the things that she did when she was a child that were early signs of her mental illness, including organisational things and compulsion things and worry things and things that she was told to do by a child psychologist when she went to go and see them. And she was kind of just describing my childhood. Like, it was uncanny the amount of things she was talking about that I did, and I found that quite hard. So unfortunately, I had to DNF this book. I really wanted to keep reading it, and I actually felt really guilty at the time about DNFing it, but I know that it was the right thing to do and that I shouldn't feel guilty. But I still wanted to talk about it in this video because I did pick it up, and I would like to draw some attention to this publisher because I think what they do is really fab. Obviously, I can't actually recommend the book because I haven't read it, but maybe it would be good to pick up if you're wanting to learn more about anorexia. And the final book that I read in February was Lily's Just Fine by Jill Stewart. So I actually read this book for work. I didn't read it for pleasure in my own time. I read it because I was working on it. I was actually a proofreader on this book. But I figured it's still a book and I still read it, so here it is. So this is a YA contemporary novel that is going to be published by Sweet Cherry Publishing, where I work, in July. It's the first in a series, and it focuses on our protagonist called Lily, who lives in a Scottish seaside town over the course of a summer. During this summer, among many other things, Lily decides to take on organising a gala for the community. Some of the main themes explored in this book are illness, both physical and mental. In particular, one of the characters in this novel has chronic fatigue syndrome, and it looks at how we perceive and deal with different forms of illness. There's some LGBTQIA+ themes explored in this novel surrounding things like inclusivity, and there's also some friendship and familial themes as well. Let's just take a moment to look at the gorgeous design, shall we? I love the vibe of it so much. I think it's so cool. I love the blue on the front and the yellow spine. Shout out to Rhiannon, you did pretty well. Lily is a fab protagonist. She is very proactive and strong-willed, to say the least. She goes on quite the journey throughout this book of self-discovery and self-development. There's also some really cool side characters in the novel. I don't want to go into too much detail or give too much away. I don't want to make it spoilery, but there's some really good friendships in here. There's characters of different ages, and there's also present parental relationships as well in here that are understandably complex. And I think that's really great because parental relationships often seem to be missed out, especially in YA novels. Obviously, this isn't a review. I'm not reviewing this book in the same way that I'd review other books I read, because that would be weird. But I did read it this month, and I thought I would tell you all about it. I know a lot of you like reading YA contemporaries, so I thought you might be interested in it. I will say that we do have some proof copies of Lily available at work, so if you are a YA booktuber or book blogger and you're interested in receiving a review copy, it's probably worth emailing us and we'll see what we can do. Note that, like any other proof copy, there is errors in it. It was printed before proofreads were done, so it won't be perfect, just bear that in mind. So yes, that's Lily. Pretty exciting. So there we go. Those are all the books that I read this February. I hope you all enjoyed hearing about them. I feel like I had a really good mix this month. It was a really good reading month. I'd love to know what you guys have been reading recently as well. Please let me know down below in the comments and we can talk about them and you can give me some recommendations. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. As always, I do appreciate it a lot. I hope you're all really well, and I will see you next week. Bye guys.